Derek Chauvin trial today. We heard from George Floyd's girlfriend. Very interesting testimony. And so we hear a little bit more about their drug use and some of the struggles that George Floyd had with addiction. And we want to break down how this might play out for the jurors. Of course, that's what we're looking at, everything through the lens of the jurors. What are they seeing? What are they interpreting this to mean? And so we've got a lot to break down here. Now, in this segment, we've got a lot of different clips. Some are very provocative, some not so provocative. As is usual, try to balance this out a little bit, right? And right now, just as a reminder, we are in the government's case in chief. So these are the government's witness. These all are individuals who should be relatively favorable to the government's case. They should be friendly witnesses for George Floyd and for that side of this case. So let's take a look at our trial board as is usual. You're going to notice here today we heard from this prosecutor. We also heard from Mr. Frank, and we also heard from Steve Schleicher. Nothing really else changed. We still saw that Eric Nelson is really the only person working for the defense with his assistant, and then of course Derek Chauvin's in the courtroom. Jurors obviously haven't changed. These are the witnesses that we heard from today. So we started off with the girlfriend, and we're going to go through her name. Her name is Courtney Ross, and she had a long series of testimony, or long testimony today, taking place all this morning. We're going to get into her here shortly. We also have paramedic number 1, paramedic number 2 who showed up. We have a fire captain, and we had a sergeant. And so we're going to hear clips from these 3 individuals today. I've got a summation of these last 2 witnesses, but their testimony was largely, I would say, foundational. And this third sergeant, the sergeant for the 3rd precinct, did have some testimony. He was actually still testifying as I was sort of buttoning up for this program. So if there's anything new that he said this afternoon that I have not seen yet, we'll cover that tomorrow. So let's get into the witnesses. As I mentioned, we're going to start off with George Floyd's girlfriend, and this is her name. Her name is Courtney Ross. We can see her here. She is in court. She gets very emotional throughout this entire presentation today. Her entire testimony was very emotional. Actually, it was hard to watch, really, because you could almost not even understand her for about the first several minutes of her testimony. Just kind of very emotional, almost to the point where she could almost not even speak. And so, one of the things that is a legal concept that I want to frame out before we dive into the testimony today is this concept called drawing the sting. All right. And this is a legal concept that I learned about in law school. Other lawyers will talk about it. Some other lawyers will call it some other things, like embracing the ugly, right? Sometimes you have a case and you got some ugly facts in your case. Just got to embrace that. And so this sort of what is happening right here. It's called drawing the sting. And when I threw this into Google, I found a nice little a post from somebody named Jill over from jasmith.com. It's a blog written in 2008. And she gives us a summation of it and what it means. She says, when I was in law school, a trial practice professor of mine discussed a technique called drawing the sting. It referred to the strategic revelation of negative information about your client so the other side couldn't stage a dramatic uncovering of the same information. The logic was simple. If it's going to come out, let it come out in a way that allows the home team to retain some control over how the information is presented. This technique, when done well, also has the collateral effect of making you look frank and forthright instead of dishonest and sneaky. The effect of drawing the sting can ripple outward from disclosure, having impact far beyond the moment when the information is given. Therefore, whenever possible, the information has to be given in a straightforward, undramatic manner in an atmosphere lacking in emotional charge. The less emotional freight you load on the revelation, the less it will travel. The less emotional freight you load onto the revelation, the less it will travel. Well, that doesn't really make sense. All right, so here's the point of this statement. This is what's happening here. There's going to be a lot of conversation in this trial about George Floyd and whether or not he died of a drug overdose. Last minute ingestion of drugs for the purpose of concealment is how Judge Peter Cahill phrased this. So the idea being that George Floyd at the very last minute consumed drugs. That's what killed him. So if you are a prosecutor, how do you rebut that? How do we show that if the defense comes out and they say George Floyd has toxicology levels that say he had 11 nanograms per milliliter in his blood, people die as low as 3 nanograms per milliliter. So how do you combat that? It's pretty easy. You just embrace the fact that George Floyd was a drug addict. He used drugs all the time. So while 11 nanograms per milliliter might kill the average person, George Floyd was not the average person. George Floyd was a drug addict. He had a long history of opioid addiction. That's why he was allowed to survive. His body was capable of surviving at that high level. And so if this is a bad fact, we can flip it into a good fact. Ordinarily, that's not good. That he's a drug addict and that he's buying and selling drugs and he's been to rehab and he's been to the hospital for a potential overdose, all of which we're going to hear. Pretty bad facts. Unless you want to flip that to show, oh, the drugs wouldn't have killed him because he was a drug addict. See how you sort of color that nicely? So that's kind of what's happening here. Now, she is, the information that we're going to hear does not paint George Floyd in a good light. Doesn't. He's a drug addict. And there are still huge sections of this country that look at that like it's a moral failing. They look at somebody who's addicted to alcohol or drugs and they say, that's just a bad person. Why can't they just stop drinking? Why can't they just stop using drugs? Maybe if they got their life together, they wouldn't be so addicted to drugs. It's not really how it works. You know, these things are much deeper than that. So I don't look at it like a moral failing. I look at it like being human. We've all got addictions. Everybody watching this show does, whether you want to admit it or not. It doesn't necessarily have to be heroin or opioids, but it could be gaming. It could be pornography. It could be gambling. It could be food. We all have these little things that we do. Some of them are way worse than others. It's just part of the human experience. So George Floyd was a drug addict. And his girlfriend comes out today and testifies about that. So many people on the defense are saying, well, there you go. He's a drug addict. So clearly it was the drugs that killed him. It could not have been Derek Chauvin. They're saying, no, yeah, you're right. In fact, he was a drug addict. That's why we know it's Derek Chauvin, because he would normally be able to operate at high levels of drugs because he's been using drugs for a long period of time and hasn't killed him before. He went to the hospital previously, didn't kill him. The knee did. This is how the prosecution is going to be reframing this. All right, so let's take a look at the first witness. This is George Floyd's girlfriend, and I want to show you this. I want to show you this emotion. We're going to hear what I'm talking about. She's crying for a good minute here. We'll see how long we can bolster through it. I don't like to watch people sad. I don't like to watch people emotional. And you can have this, you can interpret this in one of two ways. One, this is genuine emotion. Number two, this is performative. She's George Floyd's is a pseudo heir, and she wants to make sure there's justice on his behalf. So you can pick it up both sides. Genuine emotion, fake performance. This is what the jury decides. This is their decision. They get to answer those questions and decide this witness's credibility. But this is her sobbing. You can judge for yourself.
When was it that you first met Mr. Floyd?
May I tell the story?
Sure.
Okay. It's one of my favorite stories to tell. Excuse me.
And Ms. Ross, just so you know, if you feel like you need to just take a moment to collect yourself, feel free. We're in no rush here.
Thank
right?
you.
Yep.
In August 2017, I had gotten off work one night. I worked at a coffee shop for 22 years now, part-time. And I was tired and I just cleaned up and closed up the shop. And I went to go visit my son's father, who was staying at Harbor Lights, the Salvation Army shelter.
All right, so that story goes on. Caught me in the middle of a drink there. That story goes on, and it's just a big, long story. How they met, fell in love, all of that stuff. Then it sort of moves into some conversation about, well, let's watch this next clip. This is where she comes out pretty clearly and says that drugs were a part of this relationship. This is the drawing the sting. They know, the prosecution knows that the defense is going to come out and all day wave around the toxicology report. So they don't want the defense to come out and the first time the jurors to hear about opioid addiction or drug use from the defense, they're going to say, hey, it's part of our case. It's a bad fact. We got to deal with that. So how are they going to do it? They're going to put a positive spin on it. They're going to say he was an addict. What do we do with addicts in this country if we're compassionate people? We help them. We want to get them off of the drugs. Some people do. Other people just want to throw them in prison. All right. But I don't, right? And so speaking to sort of the humanitarian in people, in the jurors, you can see here how the prosecutor is sort of working her through this. And you'll notice in that last clip that it's hard to come out and be a judge of a witness as to whether or not it's being performative or whether it's being sincere. It's not really my place to make that call. The jurors can make that call. But you'll notice that it absolutely comes out from the prosecutor, right? The prosecutors do this all the time. So do defense attorneys. Sort of like consoling the witness. Oh, yeah, it's okay. Take your time. I know it's hard, right? It's so difficult. I know. When really these, I'm not saying that I don't believe them, that they're not genuine. But it's a little performative. It's a little we add a little bit more on there. Normally if you'd say, hey, I'm so sorry you're going through this, you just turn that volume up a little bit. I know. I'm devastated that you're going through this, right? It's one of those kind of things. So you'll hear it from attorneys on both sides. And of course, he's doing that. So now this is about reframing the conversation. It's not about he's a drug addict that was, out there dealing drugs, doing counterfeit things, sort of that bad caricature of drug addicts that we have. This is about a man who is a good man who just had an addiction. And she frames it out by saying that, this was an addiction that started much the same way that many addictions do. Let's listen out here to her in this next clip.
You met Mr. Floyd at Salvation Army.
Yes.
And then proceeded to maintain a relationship with him.
Yes.
And I have to ask you if drug use was a part of that relationship.
Yes.
And what kind of drug use was a part of that relationship?
Floyd and I both suffered with the opioid addiction.
And do you know how, like for your own self,
Yeah.
how you came to be involved, with what kind of drugs and how you became
The use of
involved?
opioids. Yes. Both Floyd and I, our story, it's a classic story of how many people get addicted to opioids. We both suffered from chronic pain. Mine was in my neck and his was in his back. We both had prescriptions, but after prescriptions that were filled and we got addicted and tried really hard to break that addiction many times.
And were you each aware of each other's struggles with opioids?
Yes, eventually in our relationship we shared that.
And did you work together on that issue?
Absolutely.
And
All right, so very, very standard story. Those of you who've been around this channel for a little bit of time know that my family went through something like this as well. My younger brother, Eric, died when he was 27, died by suicide. Same story. He broke his wrist as a young man, had a number of different surgeries on that wrist, had to be prescribed pain pills for the pain pills. Those, of course, were opioids, the oxys, and things like that. Once that ran out, you're still addicted. So you go and you find other places to get it. The oxys turn into heroin. Heroin turns into rehab. Sometimes it just becomes too much. People leave the planet as a result of that. Doesn't make them bad people, just means that they had a problem that was too much for them, right? They couldn't overcome that. And so this happens to all of us. And sometimes it can result in tragedy, unfortunately. So they're taking this really bad fact and they're just owning it. They're doing a nice job of it. They're saying, listen, it's both of us. It's him and I. We struggled from the same affliction. We worked through it together. It sounds like, from that last video that they even were working on their recovery and their sobriety together, which is sort of, kind of a beautiful thing to watch people emerge from this just dreadful state of addiction into a new life. I see it very frequently with some of the guys that we work with in our men's group. So, this is a beautiful thing. So it's taking something that is very bad and putting a nice spin on it. And it sounds like maybe that was truthful. Maybe George Floyd was a very good guy, just had a bad addiction issue. And so when the defense comes back out and they start hammering drugs, criminal, no, he was just an addict. Addicts don't deserve to die. Also deserve humanity and respect. And so they're taking that bad fact, they're wrapping it up in nice gift wrap, and it looks pretty good until Mr. Nelson comes back out. Now the defense attorney comes out and he starts probing a little bit further into what really happened there. So once again, you can see how the scope of this conversation changes depending on the point that the party is trying to make. So in this case, now what's going to happen is traditionally we have been seeing the prosecution wanting to narrow this down onto just the video. And the defense attorney wants to break it up, expand it all the way out, and talk about the 2020 arrest and some of the prior offenses and different drug addiction issues and all of that stuff, whereas the prosecutor wants to just hone back in on that timeline. So same type of thing is happening here. Eric Nelson now, we just heard the prosecutor who was asking her questions about the expansion of the case. So he's kind of doing the opposite today, taking it way out. Well, tell me about, where'd you meet? What'd you do? All of this stuff, addiction, really broadening this to minimize this one bad fact by wrapping a bunch of other meat around it. So now Mr. Nelson is going to squeeze it back in. He's going to clamp back down, and he's going to say, well, what about that day? What about on May 25th? Who was he with that day? Let's take a look and see what she says.
And then there were other times where you would buy other people's prescriptions from them, right?
Yes.
And then there were times when those weren't available, and so you would have to buy different types of pills, right? Unknown sources, so to speak.
Yes.
And are you familiar with Maurice Hall?
Yes.
And was Maurice Hall the person that you and Mr. Floyd bought controlled substances from?
We had.
I'm going to show you a photograph. And just to you'll be the only one who can see it at this time. It's been previously marked as Defense Exhibit 1006.
Okay.
Can you see that photograph, ma'am?
No.
Just her.
No.
Oh, sorry, I gotta get this. Can you see that photograph, ma'am?
Yes.
Is that the person you know to be Maurice Hall?
Yes.
And can you just generally describe what he's wearing?
Red hat, red pants, and a black and white shirt.
And that is up in the upper right-hand corner. Would you agree that that has the date of May 25th, 2020?
Yes.
And that's the person that both you and Mr. Floyd had previously purchased controlled substances from?
Yes.
Now,
All right, so if you noticed, he let that sit for a little while. If I played that again, which I'm not going to do, you'll notice he said, so that was the person that you and Mr. Floyd bought drugs from previously? She says, yes. Nelson just lets that meatball just hang right out there. Let that sit. Moves on to the next question. So to summarize that conversation, she and Mr. Floyd had previously purchased drugs from a guy named Maurice. Maurice, who was that guy? Same guy that George Floyd was sitting in the car with when the cops came upon them. So he was with, some people are saying, his alleged drug dealer. Could be a friend who sold him drugs that one day, or could be somebody who just regularly deals drugs. Who knows? So an unsavory character, right? And so the defense brings that out. And that doesn't kind of sound like somebody who's in recovery. That doesn't sound like somebody who's trying to kick this habit. So it kind of is a little bit of a contrast there. Now, Maurice, the individual that she just referenced, has sent in a motion. This went in yesterday at 4:14 p.m. You're going to notice this. It says notice of intent to invoke the Fifth Amendment privilege and to quash the subpoena. So this was filed yesterday at 4:14 in the state of Minnesota versus Chauvin. We can see here Mr. Maurice Lester Hall, through undersigned counsel, provides notice to everybody that if called to testify, he's going to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination pursuant to the Constitution, and they move to quash the subpoena pursuant to the Minnesota Rules of Criminal Procedure, signed off on by Adrian Cousins, who's an assistant public defender. So he's lawyered up and he's not going to be talking about anything, which is the right thing to do. Good move. So let's take a look now and let's go back to George Floyd's girlfriend, because we're going to learn a little bit more about this drug use. And again, this is coming out from the defense. So we heard her testimony about her relationship. We saw her, how upset she was. Now this is Mr. Nelson coming back out and talking about a prior hospitalization, which happened in March of 2020. So we heard about a prior case that happened in 2019 under very similar circumstances, where George Floyd was also in an altercation with the police that resulted in him allegedly consuming drugs at the last minute, which required his hospitalization. That was in 2019. Now we have new notice that in March, apparently he had another overdose situation, and he had to go to the hospital at that time as well. Here is Miss Courtney explaining what happened there.
And was there an incident in March that required Mr. Floyd to be hospitalized?
Yes.
And that was, can you describe for the jury what that incident was?
Which date are you speaking
In
of?
March, when he was hospitalized?
We went to the hospital a couple times in March.
Okay. He was hospitalized for a more extended period of time in March, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's the incident I'm talking
Okay.
about. Okay. I understand he went once because he had hurt his hand, like cut his hand on glass or something. And that was a shorter hospital stay?
Yes.
But then there was an extended hospital stay
Yes.
in March. Can you describe for the jury what led up to that hospital stay?
Yes. Floyd, I went to go pick Floyd up from his house that night. I thought I was taking him to work. He wasn't feeling good. His stomach really hurt. He was doubled over in pain. Just wasn't feeling well, and he said he had to go to the hospital. So I took him straight to the hospital. We went to the ER, and they were checking him out in the ER, and it was getting late, and I had to get home to my son, so I left that Friday night.
You later learned that that was due to an overdose?
Yes.
You spent several days with him at the hospital, correct?
Yes.
And did you learn what caused that overdose?
No.
At that time frame, did you learn that Mr. Floyd was taking anything other than opioids?
No.
You did not know that he had taken heroin at that time?
No.
All right, so a couple things we can break down there. Number one, her testimony is actually pretty good, better than some of the other non-law witnesses. So you'll notice that when she testifies, she actually is turning, in this clip, not the previous clip, but she's turning to the jury and speaking to them. So can you tell us what happened? He says, can you tell us what happened about that 2020 case back in March? And she goes, yeah, to the jury. Hey, turns right over and talks to them. You'll notice that police do that. She was the first sort of non-law person who I've seen do that thus far. So good for her on being coachable on how to talk to the jury. Prosecution did a good job with her. So what else did she just say there? So she was talking about the idea is George Floyd had previously been almost killed due to a drug overdose, to the point that it required her to take him to the hospital and stay there for a few days. You'll notice that the last line of questioning there, he was trying to dive into whether she knew at the time. He said that a few times. Well, okay, so at the time, did you know that he was overdosing on heroin? No, she says, no, I had no idea. Well, if you watch the rest of this segment, then she actually does come back and confirm that she may have told that to the FBI or to some other investigators earlier on in the investigation. So this is another example of somebody whose memory or testimony is a little bit contradictory to what she said previously during the earlier original investigation. And so, this language was, this cross-examination was not particularly good for the prosecution, but wasn't terrible for them. They had to get this information out in front of the jury. They had to get the idea that George Floyd was an addict out, because that's actually a better framing than if he was a drug addict, right? It's a nuanced difference, but somebody who's an addict who's trying to recover is looked at a little bit more favorably than somebody who is just sort of not beyond hope. They're not even attempting to get sober anymore. They're just out there using without any remorse or even any awareness that this might be a problem. Two different things, and society views them differently. I presume the jury will as well. So now we transition. We talk a little bit more about, this is our first paramedic. His name is Seth Bravinder. This is what this guy looks like, and he was one of the first people on the scene. You may remember him, actually. I mean, his face is in one of the body camera videos where he comes out, and he kind of is just one of the first paramedics on scene. So we're going to hear from him. Then we're going to hear from another individual who showed up right after this guy. So two back-to-back medical people, and their testimony was somewhat useful. A lot of what we heard today is sort of framing out still the context of the entire situation, but it's really not getting, in my opinion, to the meat and potatoes of what the real issue in this case is, which is all about causation. What was the cause of death? We're going to get to the medical experts when we get there, but this is sort of the first person who is medical related who showed up on the scene and actually was trying to probe at George Floyd's body to determine what to do and how to treat him. So this is Seth Bravinder, a Hennepin County paramedic.
What did you see when you arrived on scene?
As we were pulling up to the scene, I saw multiple officers on the side of the road with our patient lying on the ground next to a squad car.
So as you were pulling up, was that the position that you observed them in, meaning the officers on top of the patient next to the squad car?
Yes.
Could you tell at that point, as you were approaching, what the situation was, or what the condition of the patient was at that moment?
No, there were multiple officers on top of the patient when we pulled up at that point. We assumed, I assumed that there was potentially some struggle still because they were still on top of him. So
Okay.
that was my assumption when we pulled up.
So when you got to the scene, having no additional information, seeing what you saw, that's what was going through your mind, is that
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So when you got to the scene, what did you do next?
Parked the ambulance near the patient and got out. I walked to the back of the ambulance and my partner walked over to check on the patient.
And what did you see when you got out of the ambulance in terms of the patient's condition at that point?
I was standing a little ways away, so I couldn't get my partner would have a more accurate description of his condition at that point. But from what I could see where I was at, I didn't see any breathing or movement or anything like that.
Did he appear to be unresponsive to you at that point in time?
From what I could tell, just standing from a distance, yes.
And was he in handcuffs?
Yes.
And we're describing the patient here. Was that patient later identified as George Floyd?
Yes.
So when you got out, your partner first approached, is that right? What were you doing at that initial point in time when you first got there?
As he went over to check on the patient, I was watching him to kind of get a cue on what we were going to do next because, we're still determining what the patient's condition was. So I was kind of waiting for him to go check on the patient and then know what to do next.
And at that point in time, when you were standing outside, your partner was approaching the patient, did you see a struggle of any kind going on, any movement, anything like that?
No.
Okay. So after your partner first approached, did you see what he was doing?
Yeah, he checked a pulse on his neck, a carotid pulse, and also looked like he checked the patient's pupils.
And did you discuss with your partner at that point next steps?
Yeah, he walked back towards me and I asked, is he in cardiac arrest? He said, I think so.
So use the word cardiac arrest. What does that mean?
It's a term we're going to use for anybody that's not responsive, not breathing, and doesn't have a pulse currently.
All right, so not a lot out of this guy's testimony, Seth's testimony. He was sort of laying out some of the procedural framework there, showed up, got out, assessed the patient. You heard it. Nothing too groundbreaking there. Not even any really good sound bites that you can run with. Sort of mechanical, right? Showed up, saw that there was nothing really going on there. I presumed that there was still a struggle because they were still on top of him. But by the time my partner, who we're going to hear from next, by the time he checked his pulse and his pupils, well, we're going to hear what he says. And so this is where they're sort of framing out the idea that maybe they should have rendered aid earlier. And this is where we get into a separate issue about this depraved mind and whether this was some sort of negligence that would rise to the level of manslaughter or murder because they should have rendered aid. In other words, a man was dying right under their bodies, right under their knees and arms, and they didn't render aid. So how do you overcome that? Well, the next argument is going to be that they had to continue to execute their duty as police officers rather than render aid, right? They have to prioritize certain activities. One is maintaining order, conducting an arrest, responding to threats around them. The other is to preserve life, and they have to prioritize those things. It's going to be a tricky thing to do, isn't it? So let's take a look at paramedic number 2, and this is not good for the defense. This guy shows up. Here's what he says.
Sorry.
And when you approached, you said he was in handcuffs. As you approached him to inspect further, were the officers still on top of him?
The officers were still on him when I approached.
And what did you do when you approached?
I was assessing the scene and running through what care may be needed.
And did you take some initial steps, like checking for a pulse?
I checked for a pulse.
And did you also check the individual, Mr. Floyd's pupils?
I did.
And what did you determine at that point?
They were large, dilated.
So you determined that his pupils were large and dilated. What about a pulse?
I did not palpate a pulse.
And when you say palpate, is that you didn't feel or detect a
I
pulse?
did not detect a pulse.
And what did his condition appear to be to you overall?
In lay terms, I thought he was dead.
So what did you do next?
I kind of looked for my partner and told him I think he's dead and I want to move this out of here.
Okay.
And I will begin care in the back
Did you say you would begin care in the back?
of my rig.
And is the rig where your equipment is to deal with something like a cardiac arrest?
Yes, miss.
Okay, so they actually do load George Floyd up into the back of the vehicle. In the ambulance, they move the ambulance down a couple of blocks because the crowd was now getting a little bit out of control. So they wanted to go to a safer location. So you kind of got two things that are going on here. You know, number one, this guy shows up within a second. It sounds like pupil pulse says this guy's dead. Right? That's not a good fact for the defense. That means that Chauvin and the other two officers who were laying on Floyd were laying on a dead guy, according to this guy. Right? He had already died. He'd expired right in front of them, and they didn't do anything about it. That's not going to sit well with the jury. The second thing that is not so good for the prosecution is that this guy, when he showed up, he also recognized that this was a dangerous scene. This was not something that was safe. We're not going to start doing chest compressions right here in the middle of the road because he could feel it that this did not feel safe. So they actually had to load George Floyd up and relocate him. They strap him to a chest compression machine in the back of the ambulance. Some very gruesome pictures that you can see if you watch the full trial, where then the machine does chest compression so that they can start doing other things like opening up the airways and whatnot. And they were not able to do that right there because it was an unsafe environment according to his own testimony. They had to move. So you've got some good testimony for the prosecution and some not so good testimony for the prosecution. Because if they had to move, if the situation was so volatile and so dangerous, then you could extrapolate that Derek Chauvin was also feeling that same thing, and he also had to prioritize his response. And so if you can show through the Minneapolis Police Department or some of their protocols that you've got to maintain order, you've got to protect yourself and your own life before you start worrying about your surroundings, sort of like in the airplanes, right? Put your mask on before you put somebody else's mask on. Chauvin had to do that for himself and the officers, will be the defense argument. So they couldn't really focus on Floyd, who was already resisting arrest and already disobeyed a number of different commands, and by the way, died of drug overdoses anyways, right? That's going to be the defense. And so this guy gives them a little bit of that. Not a lot, but a little bit is there. Now we've got two other witnesses that I want to fly through just for the sake of time. We have the fire captain. His name is Jeremy Norton. He rode the fire truck from his station to Cup Foods only to find no patient there. So he encountered an agitated to distraught off-duty firefighter Genevieve Hansen, who we heard from on Monday. Norton said he inquired more about her concerns. Norton soon learned over the radio that he and his rig were needed elsewhere immediately for someone injured in a scuffle. They went back over to 36th Street and Park. Floyd was being treated by paramedics. He was unresponsive, body on a cot, Norton said of Floyd. We did multiple pulse checks, never found a pulse all the way back to the medical center. With the call complete, he returned his attention back to Hansen, the off-duty firefighter. He said, I understood the justification for her duress. So not a lot there from him. We have this other guy who is a sergeant over with the 3rd Precinct, which I think got burnt down after Kamala Harris bailed out a bunch of the protesters. This guy's a supervisory sergeant in the 3rd Precinct, which covers 38th in Chicago. He was alerted to reports about the officer's action outside of Cup Foods. According to earlier testimony, he fielded concerns on May 25th about possible excessive use of force by officers while detaining Floyd. He said it sounded like a less serious takedown, according to dispatch audio from that night. Prosecutor Steve Schleicher reviewed various department policies about when officers must report use of force, with takedown not being on that list. So Plager spoke with Chauvin by phone after being alerted to the incident, and they played some of this audio today. It said, Chauvin said, we had to hold a guy down on the audio call. Said going crazy, wouldn't got in the back of the squad. Plager testified that he was told that Floyd became, quote, combative after struggling with him. He suffered a medical emergency and an ambulance was called. That's what he was told. Asked whether Chauvin mentioned any use of force, he said, I don't believe so. So Chauvin did not mention putting his knee on Floyd's neck, the sergeant said. So some interesting testimony. As I mentioned, I did not finish this guy's testimony, so if I'm missing anything, I'm sure I will see it after the show, and we'll cover that tomorrow. So that's what happened today in the Chauvin trial. Today was, day 16? We've got a lot more of this to go. Haven't even really gotten into any of the heavy lifting yet when it comes to expert witnesses or anybody who's going to be coming in and testifying about the ultimate cause of death, which is going to be a big portion of this case. So we'll see what we've got tomorrow. Maybe we'll get started on that. Maybe not. Probably be more foundational stuff. And we'll see what Monday has. But stick around if you want to be a part of that. If you want to ask some questions, you're free to do that. For some reason, they're not showing up in my slides. And we'll figure that out